Hi, this is Rich Call, Rogue Sniper Paintball.com. Today's April 26, 2012. It's a new year, we got a lot to go over, so let's get to it. I began this year by taking measurements off my tank model and doing a little designing in CAD. Now that the tank is on the ground, it is a little difficult to work on the lower hull, so I started working on the upper hull. I was able to find all the Pioneer tools I needed at various stores, some of which had to be modified. The mini shovel had to be resized because it was too big. I cut off about an inch all the way around the shovel blade and half the blade socket. I also shortened the length of the shaft and replaced the end of the D-handle with a piece of wood to replicate the original. The only place I could find a 36-inch pinch point pry bar was online. I had to cut off about 5 inches to get it to scale. I also had to cut a pickaxe handle in half and do a lot of shaping on the belt sander to make it fit the pickhead axe I found last year. The axe and sledgehammer were close enough to scale so I didn't have to modify them. I will eventually refinish all the wooden handles. Next step was to make tool mounts using various sizes of steel flat bar, angle, tube, and some steel pipe. These took a lot of time and had to be mounted through to the underside of the panels. Once I'm ready to close up the lower hull, I'll fill in all the holes and simulate weld beads with construction adhesive that I have done in other parts of the build. One tool I couldn't buy was the wrench that's used to adjust the track tension wheels. I cut a piece of 3/8 steel bar to the correct shape. It only took 3 cutting discs and a grinding wheel to make. I then scratched the shape of the nut into the steel bar and drilled out as much of the hole as I could. I then used a hacksaw to cut out even more of the metal, as the next step was to file the finished shape. 1 hour later, I had a finished wrench. The wrench is held in place with a pin attached to a chain. This chain is a little big, but I had it lying around, so I figured I'd use it. All the tools are strapped down using leather straps like this one. I did my best to reproduce them using 3/4 inch leather bridle strap. They're basically a belt with a double belt keeper. I primed and painted the roller buckles in olive drab and then clear coated them. They're a little shiny, but the weather should fix that eventually. The leather is a little lighter than I hoped, but again, weather. All these straps needed mounts, so after modifying my vise so I could make smaller bends, I made 9 loops. Hours later, they were all threaded. They mount to the panels the same way the engine hatch door handles mount. Using a 1/2-inch U-bolt, a torch, and a sledgehammer, I bent the U-bolts so they sat vertically on the rear panel. I then welded on and ground down a nut to replicate the casting on the rear lift hooks. One unique feature of the 105mm Sherman was it could be used as an artillery piece for indirect fire. On the left side of the hull was a rack used for holding aiming poles for laying in the gun. The aiming poles and 2 of the cleaning rods would sit in the rack. They were held in place using leather straps. I made the poles from wood and dowel rod. The couplings are made by welding a nut to a piece of pipe and then gluing them to the end of the poles. A piece of threaded rod connects the sections. They're painted using alternating red and white stripe pattern. Here they are in the finished rack. Due to the fact that my gun will not be able to fire beyond line of sight, they are merely for detail purposes and will be stored in a canvas bag on the rack when not in display. I also made the main gun cleaning rods in the same way as the aiming poles. Once the cleaning rods were done, I painted the metal ends, along with all the metal parts of the tools in a gray, hammered metal paint. All the wood was finished in an American walnut stain. Here is the completed rack with the aiming poles and 2 sections of the gun cleaning rods. 4 more rods will be stored on a mount under the rear folding rack. Using 2 sheets of 16-gauge steel I found, I began the lower part of the rack. I had to weld a 3-inch piece to the end of one of the sheets. This began many hours of welding horror. Several holes opened up and many patches had to be cut and re-welded. 16-gauge was a little too thin for the stick welder, but somehow I got through it. Sort of. I bent the front edge of the sheet to form a lip and then made the cleaning rod mounts. If you couldn't tell, this is the end that had the 3-inch piece welded on. The left cleaning rod mount is welded to the rack, while the right one is hinged to allow access to the rods. This cage will house a swab for the barrel that attaches to the protruding rod end. The rack is mounted to the tank with 3 brackets that are screwed into the frame. A hinge is then bolted to the bracket. An angle bracket is then welded to the back of the sheet and to the hinge. I then cut down the top edge and finished welding the sheet to the bracket. The 2 sheets are then connected with a second set of hinges. 2 hinge supports hold the rack in the open position. Using thumb screws, I made mounts that hold the rack against the rear panel and in the closed position. I also welded on tie-downs. A piece of squared tube is attached to support the center of the rack. The rack can be folded up to allow access to the engine starter handle. The handle is not needed for my engine, but is there for detail purposes. A leather strap holds it to the rear panel. After years of looking, many emails, and even more phone calls, I hit the jackpot. I found Formply. It's waterproof birch plywood that I'm using for my track pads, and the supplier was only 15 minutes away. At $238 for 2 sheets of 3/4 inch, it's expensive, but will save me a lot of problems by not having to use solid hardwood. One thing I picked up ahead of time was the springs for the suspension. I made a quick mount to test these out, fearing they wouldn't be strong enough. I couldn't even compress them all the way by standing on one. The store didn't have enough of the 6-inch springs, so I had to buy 2 7-inch ones. Nothing a hacksaw can't fix. Every time I do an update video, I'm always sick, so the audio sounds like crap. Sorry about that. I've already started into another project, but I need to take a break because I got stuff around the house I need to work on. The next update should be at the end of June. By then, I might have the upper hull done. I'll see you then.